Yes, good afternoon, good evening, and I think good morning to some of our panelists joining us online. My name is Moses Owiny. I am the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Multilateral Affairs. I'm very pleased to be in this panel today. We are supposed to talk about post-Cotonou agreement or framework. And we want to understand what is it all about when we talk about post-Cotonou agreement. What does it mean? What are the practical realities around that?
In April 2021, the EU and the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States, or ACPS, concluded a new agreement putting an end to months of negotiations to frame the post-Cotonou era. This new treaty is setting the political, economic, and cooperation framework between Africa and the EU for the next 20 years to come. While certain aspects of the Lomé Convention of 1975 and the Cotonou Agreement of 2000 remain in this new treaty, its structure and content have been significantly revised. The new accord is regional by nature, including distinct protocols for Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific regions. Regionalized treaties offer more power to each of the three regions, enabling Africa's weight in the European Union's external ties to be much more noticeable. In addition, since 2000, new challenges such as increased migration flows, climate change, and terrorism have emerged as priorities in the EU-ACP relationship, while the EU's preferential trade treatment for ACP states has become obsolete. With the end of the European Development Fund, EDF, aid is not at the center of the partnership anymore. The economic and political rise of middle-income countries, particularly China, has altered the balance in the field of development cooperation. In this context and over the years, it looks like the ACP-EU collaboration has steadily developed from a preferential arrangement to a mutually beneficial alliance based on shared interests.
For your information, the post-Cotonou agreement was the EU and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States reached a political deal in December, I think last year, in regard to having a trading agreement between EU and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States. So today we want to discuss about this. We want to unravel it. We want to have a clear understanding and also draw implications about these issues, what it means for us as Ugandans, as Africans, and other stakeholders. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen online, thank you so much for joining. And also with me here is Jackie Batamoliza. She's a resident researcher at the Great Lake Institute for Strategic Studies. Jackie, you are most welcome. And yes, Ivan, you are most welcome. Ivan,
thank you,
is a lawyer, is a researcher, and also a scholar. Ivan, you're most welcome. So, diving deep, I wanted to start with Alexander. Alexander, Alex, as I call you, I would like to hear from you. When we talk about post-Cotonou agreement, what is it about? But also, I want you to bring the other dimension of the economic partnership agreement. Because we know that some African states, and especially even within the EAC, this African region, like Rwanda and Kenya have already signed the bilateral agreement with EU as far as economic partnership agreement is concerned. So the issue is it the same? What are the complementarity? Are there any divergence? We need to have this basic understanding. Alex, thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much for giving me the floor at the outset, and good afternoon to everybody. I think you're very sturdy, having lasted through the week and now have this discussion on a Friday afternoon. Perhaps I should start to frame a little bit more what is this agreement all about. And I have to go a few steps back to tell you where we come from, because this agreement is not it's standing in a sequence of agreements that we have concluded since 1975, starting with what was called at the time Lomé I. Yeah, so we have these agreements now for more than 45, 46 years in place. And of course, the world has changed a lot. These agreements were always followed by new agreements. They were renewed initially after 5 years, then Lomé IV 10 years, then now Cotonou 20 years, and now we are basically we have negotiated the follow-up meeting to what is the currently in place agreement, which is called Cotonou Agreement. Yeah. Now, what's important to note is that with the Cotonou Agreement, the let's say the trade aspect of the Lomé Conventions was taken out of the agreement, yeah, and separate trade agreements were concluded that you referred to as well, which are the economic partnership agreements. So post-Cotonou and trade agreement in a more narrow sense is no longer together, but this is not new. This was basically the case since 2008. Cotonou came in 2000, and then while these agreements, these economic partnership agreements were negotiated, this trade regime was still in place until it was finally replaced by the EPAS. Now, the EPAS is a long discussion, very emotional at times, and so on. But we have moved on, and EPAs are under implementation, where they have been signed and implemented since for more than 10 years now. I think starting with the Caribbean in 2008 now. So the Cotonou Agreement was also in a way a novelty, because it moved already a step away from a pure cooperation agreement, where basically a collective agreement between what is today the European Union and the group of the ACP countries, the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, where our relations were largely dominated by aid cooperation. Yeah. And the instrument for this aid cooperation was the European Development Fund, which existed actually since, as long as the European Union existed, was already introduced at the time when the Rome Treaty that established the European Economic Community in 1958 started. Yeah, and so the agreement and the financial amount, the fund always went together. The issue was that, basically what was a legal agreement, in a way was limited to basically to implement the EDF. But of course, our relations have become over the years much more complex. Cotonou then introduced a political dimension into the agreement and took out the trade. And now with the new agreement, basically also the European Development Fund has been taken out. It's no longer part of the agreement. The agreement is, in our terms, in our legal terms, an association agreement. The European Union has quite a number of association agreements with third countries. None of them, by the way, have any, at least a sort of dedicated financial envelope. Our cooperation, the funding of our cooperation with third countries is part of the European Union budget. Yeah, and what has been normal for the rest, our relations with the rest of the world has now become also the norm for our relations with the ACP. That doesn't mean that there is less money or whatever. In fact, there is more money, yeah? And that the current or the new, let's say, medium-term financial framework of the European Union, the resources that have notably been allocated to Africa have quite a bit increased, despite the fact that we don't have the European Development Fund. No? So what is new with this agreement is apart from the fact that the European Development Fund is no longer, let's say, linked directly to the agreement. The agreement has become essentially a more political agreement, yeah? That in a way governs all aspects of our bilateral relationship, yeah? All aspects of the relation between individual ACP countries and the European Union. And while trade remains apart, so we have moved on in line with the development, the evolution of our relations. The ACP countries, and let me just focus a bit more on the African countries, have also matured. We are no longer in the same setting that we were in, let's say, in the immediate post-colonial period in 1975. At the same time, the European Union is no longer composed of the 6 original countries, or the 9 at the time when Lomé was concluded. We are now 27. You know, the UK has left, and most of those European countries have absolutely no colonial relationship with the ACP countries. No? So the European Union has evolved, become bigger, become more integrated, has also developed its common foreign and security policy. At the same time, let's say the African ACP countries have matured a lot, are more self-confident today, and are also not defined by a colonial past, which has possibly still, of course, its aftermath, its consequences, but this is no longer the determining element for our relations. Now, when you look into the agreement, it governs almost everything that our relations could entail. You could see it as a kind of manual also, because not everything that is in the agreement now is relevant, yeah, for let's say a particular country. We have to now see how this agreement can be, let's say, can be a vehicle for developing our relations in all its aspects.
Before we come back to the room here, I would still like to get online with Charles. Charles, as you are aware, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a debate that has been going on. In fact, I think even in this country, we have been having conversations around that. Now, you have heard that the post-Cotonou agreement is a bilateral agreement between EU and the Organization of Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific States. In your view, do you see a complementarity between this bilateral arrangement? Do you see any divergence? Is there any consequence to the intra-Africa trade? What is your overall assessment?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. As Alex says, it's true that the post-Cotonou agreement is very thin. There is virtually no trade, and all that has got into the EPA. But the post-Cotonou agreement carries forward the logic of the EPA in several respects. Let me just speak of one. One is the idea of you have the European Union coming as a single bloc, and it is negotiating with the regional economic blocs. So, the ESC and I think ECOWAS, and in some of these cases, the blocs are not part of already existing blocs. So there are people who have a lot of problem with that. The biggest one, and which I think has some validity, is if you look at it from the point of view of the Africa, Common Free Trade Area. For it to work, it actually requires that we collapse the wall of our regional blocks, because our regional blocks, and we are seeing that a lot now with the East African community and the overlaps and a lot of tariff tensions with, for example, COMESA. For the African Common Free Trade Area to work, it requires a lot of the blocks, the walls that exist between blocks to come down. So by negotiating with blocks, essentially, there is a sense in which the EU is balkanizing and making it that much more difficult for AFTA to work as it is envisioned. But that said, there are some very positive things, and one of it is it's because really at the base of it, it is an argument over tariffs, and my own view is that when that the Africa Common Free Trade Area has exactly the same problems, that really the magic bullet will be lowering or, if possible, totally get rid of tariffs. And to the extent that, the EPA and, the Cotonou framework brings forward that logic. In some of the areas it talks about development, and when it talks of the environment and migration, you can see that logic coming through. So I think that in that sense, it is a positive thing. It seeds the idea, and it kind of helps oil the logic of the fact that that barriers should come down. The second thing is that if you see what has happened in the last 2 years in the pandemic, these long global supply chains are fallen out of fashion. So you are beginning to see a lot of industries and manufacturers relocating their manufacturing closer home and closer to their main markets. So if you see, I'll just mention, for example, companies like Benetton, for example, which have brought a lot of their manufacturing closer home to Asia, in Africa to Asia, to Morocco, to Tunisia and Egypt. So if that is going to be a major movement as a result of the pandemic, I think that there is a way in which some of the economic and the tariff logic of the EPAs could actually work to the advantage of the African consumer.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. We'll get back. Jackie and Michelle, I've not forgotten about you. No, it's okay. I'll come back. But let me turn to Ivan, picking from where Charles has ended. The question is, how can we as Africa benefit from post-Cotonou agreement? In regard to aspects like industrialization, I don't know if you have seen the final text of the agreement, but I've seen at least the draft document as of, I think, June 2020. It enumerates, certain pillars, certain strategic pillars, and one of them is industrialization. There's the technological innovation and private sector growth. So, in your view, how do you see Africa taking advantage of these strategic pillars? Of course, cognizant of the challenges that we are still not aware about in regard to implementation mechanisms and other aspects. What is your view about this?
You know, when I was growing up, we used to be told ladies first. So I thought you'd begin with Jackie, but I accept the honor. Thank you, Mr. Wing and the team at CAS for organizing this and for the invitation. Reading the documents in respect of the agreement that we're discussing, one is tempted to ask the question, is there a new deal, which was a word first used by the Democrats in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was campaigning and trying to take America from the post-depression problems and offering a new deal. I'll leave the jury to judge whether the post-Cotonou agreement is a new deal in respect of Africa-EU relations. The jury can be out on that. But you ask a very important question. How does Africa benefit from the opportunities that are available within the agreement and the opening of doors for more trade with Europe in respect of the areas that you've confined me to? Industrialization. The second is
Technological innovation.
Technological innovation and the private sector. To answer that, you've got to ask the question that President Museveni asked so many years ago. And some people would, there can always be debate on what Africa's problem is. But I think that question is very important. What is Africa's problem? Because if we can diagnose Africa's problem, then we can attempt to prescribe solutions, but also engage more meaningfully in respect of how Africa finds its footing in these global trade partnerships and agreements. I think that in respect of industrialization, we have essentially two main bottlenecks. One is infrastructure, the other is energy. When I was driving to work this morning, I was listening to a commencement speech that Elon Musk delivered at the California Institute of Technology. And he's very passionately convinced that energy is going to determine so much in terms of how the world achieves sustainable development, but also how much potential is unlocked in any part of the globe. So if you look at Africa's energy needs, for example, for you to be able to unlock opportunities in health and education sectors, but also spur private sector growth, it's a huge gap. Average energy consumption in Africa is about, the last I checked, I was looking at the figures from the Africa Development Bank. You're talking of something in the range of 180 kilowatts per hour. In Europe, that is about 13,000 kilowatts per hour. And about 640 million Africans do not have access to energy. And electricity connection is about 40%. In Uganda, if you go to the rural areas, our electricity connection is about 19%. Of course, much higher in the urban areas. And according to the Africa Development Bank, the continent would need about between $6 and $90 billion of annual investment to achieve clean energy. So I think that energy is really at the heart of industrialization. You really can't do much if the cost of doing business is high. Small-scale enterprises, medium-scale enterprises that try to do some bit of manufacturing have a huge energy bill, and that makes it very difficult for us to create jobs because the cost of doing business is pretty high. So as an African, I would be looking at what kind of opportunities we are able to tap into in unlocking those bottlenecks. I mean, those opportunities and the potential that we have. The other is infrastructure. I was looking at figures from the Africa Economic Outlook report. The infrastructure problem in Africa is so dire that intra-Africa trade, my senior, Charles Onyango, discussed the aspect of tariffs. I think tariffs are a problem, but in my considered view, you can actually remove tariffs and still have a huge problem if the infrastructure challenges are not resolved. So the Africa Economic Outlook report tells us that Africa's trade around the world outstrips its trade with neighbors. In other words, Africa trades more with the rest of the world than with fellow African countries. That's what they call intra-Africa trade. Intra-Africa trade, in terms of Africa's trade with the globe, is about 11%. In Europe, about 50%, intra-European trade. In Asia, about 70%. So, and there's a claim that is made in that report that it is cheaper to ship a car from China to Tanzania than it is to move a car from Tanzania to Uganda or from Uganda to Tanzania, largely because of infrastructure. So I think that if opportunities like this agreement and several others and the commitments that I read in the documents that followed the discussions around this agreement can be able to help us fix our deficits in infrastructure development, then you're able to unlock a lot of potential of the African continent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Yes, so Jackie, now you second, but I think it's okay. Come back to you after the gents have spoken.
No problem.
All right. Again, the draft document that I was able to look at, the focus is on SDGs. You have also the issues of eliminating poverty, the whole issue of gender. How do you engage women, to participate in, the outcomes, the negotiated outcomes and implementation that will arise out of the framework. So my question to you is, how do you see OAPCs, and especially within our context, we can bring it even back home, how do you see Africa, Uganda advancing these commitments in regard to gender equality, in regard to elimination of poverty, and, tackling, the advantages that, the opportunities within the SDGs and aspects within the SDGs. How do you see us advancing these commitments moving forward to benefit all of us?
Thank you so much, Moses. And thank you to the team that put this together. I come from a background of international relations, and so I attach a lot of importance to the politics and the atmosphere of things. So my understanding of how one can be able to, or how we can be able to include women is the appreciation of the direction towards where the world is heading. A lot of times I think Africa and Uganda in particular has very beautiful policies, but they are designed in isolation of the political realities. And the challenge that that comes with that is that somehow our countries keep playing catch up. Looking at the SDGs and how much time we have to get into the reality of the virtual world, I don't know why we haven't complained yet where that science and technology is in as far as SDGs are concerned. So I think the same issue goes with the involvement of the women. The globe is going into, I think it's invested a lot in the aspect of inclusion, women leadership, but I think the politics get invested in the vote, and that's so much on the African continent, that we implement so much the political party aspect, and we sort of get off the international political path. So I feel like we need to engage civil society, and in this regard, I would like to acknowledge the importance and the value of the media, because the media, and sometimes I think the media keeps us in check, and generally accidentally, not intentionally. So I think there is need to reconcile the policy life of the governments that are engaged in the benefiting relationship we have with the EU, and the reconciliation between the politics and the policies designed needs to be revisited. So how do we achieve that? I think we need to engage civil society heavily in the aspect of evaluation of why we are still behind in some of these commitments. And I think civil society is, and by that evaluation, I think, need to be entrusted to the national institutions, national civil society organizations. In other words, domesticate the evaluation as much as we can, so that, and then be able to sell the value of these findings and the commitments in a manner that benefits the government. I think that's the one way we can get the governments to actually commit practically, not in writing. So I think that we need to conduct some evaluation, engage civil society in the exercise of evaluation of why we are still lagging behind. Okay. And then I want to recognize that sometimes even when that is done, I think we fall short on the aspect of human capital in as far as at the stage of data collection. And I think the late Kofi Annan is the one who was, I think, pronounced himself in that regard, if my memory serves me right. So we have pursuits that are disconnected in a way from reality. And it's not intended, but the efforts being invested need to pay extra attention to the quality of what we collect to inform the solutions we are designing.
Great, thank you very much. I will go now back to Charles. Charles, I know that human rights, democracy, and good governance are equally strategic pillars that are enumerated, in at least the document that I was able to see. And in that document, you see the negotiations that were taking place between the EU and the OACPs and areas of contention. Some of the areas of contentions were, where really African countries or OACPs were negotiating on aspects like non-interference, abiding by the principles of international law, non-interference, the question of sovereignty, we are a sovereign nation, and stuff like that. But in terms of the support that is required to advance human rights, democracy, and good governance, we have also had a very terrible trajectory and human rights records within the political domain, of ACPs. So, in your view, what do you make of, these aspects? Do you really see any concrete push for democratic, transformation in terms of our democracy, in terms of the fairness of the rule of law, and the inherent weaknesses of our democracies? How do you see this partnership improving and advancing democratic dividends for ACPs? Thank you.
Thank you. Probably let me speak on the areas where I see lots of possibilities, because in many of these African countries, they are what you call them second or third generation rights, whatever term you choose, and environmental justice, for example, is one of them. You see that in a lot of these African domestic jurisdictions, even at the regional level, they are not canvassed or entrenched in a sort of way. and even gender rights, some of these things that Ajaki was talking about, they are still very thin. So to me, one of the greatest possibilities I've seen in this is, the language around the environment. I think that it helps because it surfaces and brings on the table things which are generally thin in African domestic, legislation and policy making. There's a lot of stuff around financial governance, and I think that that's a very positive thing. Now, and I think that you are right that you are likely to have a lot of contestation and pushback and the arguments for sovereignty. But that usually happens when you're talking of human rights. Don't arrest Ivan Okuda, don't ban this newspaper, allow the opposition to be free. And in my view, this is that if you look at the regime of rights and you look at the payoff and the value that you get, I think that the payoff is probably higher these days from these other rights, gender rights, family rights, just around the action around the environment. So in that sense, I think the agreement really does help expand, the space. Where I would have an issue is it's not so much of what it provides, but what it doesn't provide. And Ivan spoke earlier about infrastructure. One of the things, and you read in the agreement, it's very poor on what you'd call delivery vehicles for some of these things. Let me give you a typical example. One of whereas it rightly recognizes the private sector and all that, but the way Africa is evolving and has organized itself, there's a lot of non-state spaces and organizations that have emerged to deliver a lot of these things, development. Take, for example, savings and credit institutions. And even when you come in terms of political activity, because the internet and social media has allowed a lot of cross-border organization around rights granting and mobilization. We saw that in 2019 in Sudan with the protests against Bashir. We saw that last year in Nigeria with the End SARS movement. So they are, how do we move from the issues and get involved with the vehicles which are making them a reality? I just think that there was an opportunity there for the agreement to have some kind of language or to even bring a certain kind of strategic positioning which allows the intervention to expand those kind of areas. And even around the whole issue of financial governance, for example, that really, you just kind of, I wish there was a bit more muscle that would have been come from the conversation, from the documentation, from the thinking to help us deliver those. So yes, there will remain to be a pushback and contestation around some of the more traditional kind of old school rights, human rights and rights to vote and democracy and all that. But I think that there are really a lot of opportunities around the agreements, recognizing and taking on board a lot of the new generation rights.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. Alex, I'm coming back to you. You were already beginning to talk about some of the strategic pillars of at least the draft document that we were able to access. But I will ask you the same question that I asked Ivan, because I know that at the end of the day, both the EU and the OACPs are looking for a favorable outcome. In fact, in one of the documents that I came through while I was reviewing several literature written about the post-Cotonou, in one of the arguments, the OACPs were pushing for a more development-oriented cooperation, and they were told, no, this is not a development cooperation, this is a trade agreement. Meaning that, at the end of the day, each party wants to score a favorable outcome. There is, an interest that, at the end of the day, is at the core of the negotiation. So, what is it really? I know it can be as easy as yes, this, but what is it in for the EU?
Okay, I think you touched on a number of aspects in your question. Let me go to this very last point. What is in for the EU at the end? Let me just respond to some of the issues that were raised by the panelists, and I think I would probably subscribe to most of the comments that were made, but perhaps just to sort of recall a bit the structure. I mean, starting from trade, we had in Lomé and at the beginning of Cotonou trade preferences, unilateral preferences for the ACP countries in their trade relationship with the European Union. And it had basically no impact because the figures were mentioned. There was no real increase in trade. I mean, trade meaning export from, let's say, African countries to the European Union. Yeah, so the trade preference, the unilateral trade preference didn't really do the trick. So the idea was to move one step further, which is, to develop the regional integration. So you have your agreement not with an individual, or you just don't give a preference to a specific country that wants to export, but you develop a trade regime whereby, let's say, the inputs that were collected from the region and that go into a product will be also reflected in the preferences. So these EPAs were meant to foster regional integration. There was no African continental free trade agreement at the time. So the starting point was where trade was already regionally organized. Now, what we let's say probably see now is that also regional integration, maybe it has advanced a little bit, but it still doesn't do really the trick, because trade alone is not sufficient, because the main problem is what we call the supply constraints. So you need to produce what is needed or what is demanded on the market at the level of quality and the prices that are competitive, and this is where the problem is. I mean, the AFCFTA will advance let's say the regional integration within the continent further, and I think everybody will agree that this is a good thing. The EPAs are in a way building blocks to this. Eventually they will come on board. This will become all one eventually. Of course, then, I mean, developing the intra-African trade is at this point probably more of a priority for Africa than the trade agreement with the European Union. That will come at some point down the road once the AFCFTA has developed some results now. But on the issue of supply constraints, this is really not easy to tackle, and some aspects were mentioned by the other panelists. I mean, energy, infrastructure, but also human development. I mean, you need also educated, energetic young people with ideas and initiative, and that is combined with capital investment and so on. So this is the complicated part, yeah. And what we have, let's say, in this post-Cotonou agreement is basically more or less the whole policy toolbox that you would need to address it. But from that toolbox, you now have to see exactly what is the relevant issue in a specific country, and what can the relationship with the European Union do to support that country in developing the economic dynamics. Okay. Yeah. So in that sense, the agreement is it's a new deal in the sense that it has the entire policy toolbox, but then again not completely, because what is needed now is doing it. So we have a legal framework which offers us an awful lot of opportunities, but it will just simply remain paper if we are not managing to translate these opportunities into reality. That means that we develop, let's say, a relationship, and not just by providing aid. Aid will continue, which is a resource transfer, will play a certain role, but it has to be more. Yeah, it has to be more. We have to, let's say, develop our relationship in a way that we also close let's say, the technology gap. I mean, the technology gap is getting bigger and bigger. I mean, you see how, when you just read the news, what is being at the technological forefront developed and what comes out of Africa from this, the gap is huge, and we need to get this close, because otherwise continent will struggle to catch up now. And that requires huge investments into people's education, into exchanges that we need, that we learn from each other. And yeah, it is not just capital investment, it's not just infrastructure, it's not just providing energy, it's the complexity of all of this together. Yeah. So in that sense, I would say there is a new deal, but it's only half of the deal. So there is more to come. Now,
as you conclude
on the question, what is in here for the EU? That's an interesting one, because I mean, as you know, I was ambassador myself several times, and I was always confronted with this question. Why are you giving us the aid? What is your interest? Huh? And that is a rather it is a simple one in many cases, and it's a hugely complex one in others. Let's put it like this, or let's take an example. First of all, the starting point is, it is in the European interest that the African continent is developed. It is our own interest, not just because of migration. We want a strong partner at our southern border. Yeah, you're our neighboring continent. Now we cannot, let's say, we cannot have an interest in crisis everywhere, in dramas everywhere. This is not what will establish a sound basis for relations. So first of all, development and stability in the continent is an essential interest. That's in a way the starting point. Now, when you look at what we were just talking about, we need investments. So the problem of European industries is that they don't invest enough in Africa now. So, but once they start investing in Africa, you will hear exactly the opposite argument. You say, yeah, the Europeans, they want to exploit the continent. No? So you see the difficulty to strike a balance where you can say, okay, here there are African interests, but we need to combine this with European interests, because otherwise there will be no economic cooperation. Yeah, because if there is no interest to go to Africa and to develop the industries, to train the people and so on, it's not gonna,
Thank you.
it will not work. No?
Thank you very much, Alexander. You have made the point very clear. We have heard you, but we also need to engage our audience. For our audiences, we'll come back to you shortly in about 2 to 3 minutes, so you can prepare your questions and your comments. But Ivan, in about 3 minutes or even less, you have already enumerated the primary, in your view, primary, bottlenecks when it comes to industrialization and transforming, African economies. But also beyond that, there are also issues to do with empowering local industrialists, skillsmen, incentivizing, private, domestic private entities so that they're able to grow and be able to compete with the rest of other actors, either within the region or even globally. So, in your view, how do you see bilateral arrangements, not even just about the, generally bilateral, multilateral arrangements within, the arrangement that we are having with EU and OACPs? How do you see this advancing Africa's industrialization? Is there a way that Africa can push for a more self-sustaining development strategy that is deliberate in nature? What is your view?
I think for starters, as a continent or as a people, we Africans need to get serious about addressing our own problems. And when we enter into these kind of agreements or partnerships, we need to really be serious about putting our act together, because the duty to develop this continent and address the socio-economic challenges that it faces lies largely in our hands. I agree entirely with Alexander when he says it's in the interest of Europe and indeed the rest of the world that Africa is developed. I have nothing useful to add to the submission that he made. I think was right on the money. And I think that our governments really need to do a lot more than they're doing to essentially address those bottlenecks. For example, if you look at just the energy deficit or the challenge of energy in this part of the world, you have 90% of primary schools in many parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa for that matter, outside South Africa, not having access to electricity. That affects the quality of education. You have mothers dying because hospitals cannot do surgical procedures because there's no electricity connection. You have industries closing because the cost of doing business is rather high. So for us to be able to tap into the opportunities that these partnerships come with, we need to fix, to be able to fix those challenges here. Yeah. But also if our partners, in this case, the Europeans, are able to help us fix those challenges in service of their larger global trade and development interests, I think that would be a win-win for all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, our audience, you have heard from the distinguished speakers. It is your turn to hear your perspectives. I don't know where the mics are, but let me see how to pick. There's a hand here, there's a hand there, the lady over there. Okay, then the gentleman.
Thank you very much for this discussion. You've focused much on industrialization and technology. And much as Africa, we are focusing on these to be among the pillars of this, of the agreement. And also, industrialization, technological innovations, we are forgetting about agriculture. Because it is one of the main components that contributes towards the development. But what kind of agriculture are we talking about? agriculture whereby we can do value addition. Because much as we do all it takes, we engage in exports of agricultural products, but there is no value addition, then it will be very hard for us to develop. So can we also take agriculture to be a main pillar towards achieving economic development?
Okay.
And then lastly, can also focus on how we can use media to depict Africa as a hub for development. And then lastly, the last one, also focus on what strategies can we put in place to encourage export promotion instead of import, to substitute. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Robert still remains my name. I want to thank the panelists for the best they have brought out. My concern is the heading of this discussion was an opportunity, using it as an opportunity to create a new Africa and EU relationship. In your personal view, putting aside the offices you may occupy, do you personally find it as an opportunity? Looking at the previous relationships that have been in existence, why do we look at a need to create a new relationship? If that is the case, then how should we be hopeful that this new relationship we are going to have is going to be an opportunity indeed, that it is not going to do us a disservice as the previous ones? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Redempta. I am an MA student in International Relations and Diplomacy here in Makerere. My question goes to Mr. Alexander. Since this is not a trade agreement, this is a trade agreement and not a development one, like you said, where is the middle ground for both parties? How do we arrive at a win-win situation? How do we support each other to close the gaps of infrastructure, like you say, technology, stability, without exploiting each other? We all know about the different hegemonic powers. For instance, Kenya has already signed one with the EU. Some of us are still behind. Is it the more developed ones, the ones who comply with the EU standards that get the apples pie? What happens to the others who are still developing? How do we get them to arrive at the same standards as all these other countries that already lived ahead before the rest of us? We also know about capital flight. Some of the people that probably take up these opportunities are people who are in the ruling class, let's say, the elite. How do we support these ones that actually are the grassroots, that want to actually have the mandate, the opportunities?
Okay, Redempta, yes, you have got your question. Now the mic to the gentleman.
Good evening once again. I'm Senyonga Tone, a student at Makerere University. As per the theme, an opportunity to develop a new Africa, European Union relationship, what have the African governments done towards the issue of the intra-African trade so as to bring about development in the African countries respectively? And what has the European Union also done on the same issue? For example, Kenya's borders are close to our goods, and Rwanda is not also in good trade terms with us. This question goes to Mr. Ivan. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any member of the panel can respond. Yep.
Thank you, Tony. A very quick response. I don't have the figures offhand and the data, but I think that there is effort from all sides, from governments within the continent and development partners, including the Europeans and more recently the Chinese, to address some of those bottlenecks by way of more investment. There's lots of billions of dollars more in investment between 2014 and now than there was, say, 2 or 3 decades ago in energy and infrastructure. The whole continent is booming. I practice law, And construction law is one of my areas of interest. And if you look at the infrastructure projects happening just in Uganda alone, it's just amazing how much governments are putting in. And I think it's a good thing. Of course, we can do more. But I'm comforted more by Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Economic Rights. So in 1996, the people that came together to draft that covenant recognized that there is a concept called progressive realization. What progressive realization of social, economic, and even political rights teaches us is that it's impossible for any society to achieve immediate realization of all rights. And certainly, to Tony's question, in terms of addressing all bottlenecks. So societies evolve over time. If you look at the French, for example, with the concept of liberty, fraternity, and equality, that was a product of the French Revolution. If you look at Britain, for example, from the period of the Magna Carta up to where they are, it's centuries and centuries of investment and making mistakes and going back and 5 steps forward, 4 steps back. And I think that Africa's story cannot be unique. Africa's story, and even the Chinese, even before Chairman Mao, it's been almost 100 years of work in progress.
Yeah.
So the progressive realization of socio-economic and political rights, if you applied it to the development paradigm, I think is very applicable. Great. And of course, it does not insulate our governments from young people, like those I see in the audience, expecting more and expecting better and expecting all those things in a quicker time because they only have one life to live and they want to make the best of that one life that they have. So you might have progressive realization, yes, but there are certain things that just can't wait and have to be achieved a little faster. And I think addressing those development bottlenecks is one of those.
Thank you, Ivan. Jackie, do you want to pick any issue raised by the audience as also you conclude?
Yes. Someone asked if this is even an opportunity. There is this constant issue raised in African states. We want to do things the African way. Your question should be, how domestic can we still afford to be domestic? Because we are part of a moving global system. And we have to embrace that. Like, it's not something we can really run away from. Earlier on, I mentioned the direction that the world is taking, which is technology, where information is a tool of war. It's a tool for commerce. It's a tool for everything. So the reverse tradition and desire, I think, is as misdirected as many of the decisions we make in government, in different governments. And I suggest that we be able to align ourselves to the reality of the world. And so we must not expect the EU to establish government here or governing institutions beyond what we have to achieve or to make these opportunities. It's about how conversant we are with our own challenges, that we can be able to tailor desired solutions out of the opportunities handed to us. And I want to mention that as the world evolves, there's going to be way more complex international relations issues and emerging. And for now, I think we still have a big opportunity that the bodies that offer direction to the world are transparent, are accountable, and are explicit about what we have to do, where we have to go. And so the desires that we operate in a certain manner of isolation, I think is something I would encourage our governments and the people whose desires all these opportunities come to serve I think we need to look at this direction more keenly. Someone mentioned about why the element of agriculture. Again, it goes back to how well set our priorities are. How much are we aware of what we are? We are still agrarian societies. The world that is setting the direction for the countries that are setting direction for the world have already moved into the information market, information trade. We are still in agriculture. And it's hard to leap and just catch up. So I agree with you, but my agreement is of no value if our priorities are not set as they ought to be. And again, they want to be set as they ought to be unless we have the right human capital to make those judgments and accurate analysis as to why we need to, have well-informed decisions in as far as moving forward is concerned.
Yep.
And I think I would like that to answer the person who asked about why is Uganda not, already aligned just as Kenya is with the EU, and I think recently I think they signed some agreements with the US, or some are still I think in the pipeline. It still comes down to who informs or what informs the decisions we make when we are getting into these agreements. And when we have gotten into these, by the way, even when we've gotten into these agreements, there is still a challenge at the level of implementation. Mm-hmm. A lot of times you have the politics, which I earlier on hinted to, the politics interfering or seeming more valuable to the implementers than the agreed directions. Yeah. That doesn't mean that the effort does not exist, but how appreciated this direction is also, I think, is a great, goes a great way into how we achieve our commitments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alexander, I know Redemptor asked you a specific question, so I would like you to respond to that question and also make your concluding remarks, and then we'll also ask Charles to respond or add in anything, and as we conclude and close this discussion.
No, thank you very much again for giving me the floor. No, very briefly, because I could, of course, answer to in a way contribute to all the questions, but maybe the second question was the one that allows me to wrap up more easily, which is, are we here in front of an opportunity with the new agreement? Why do we need a new relationship? I mean, the answer is also, wrapping up from the discussion, is that there are many aspects that have been brought up today and which are all in one way or another reflected in the agreement. And we can make, let's say, use of this relationship between, African countries, including Uganda and the European Union, to make this relationship more productive, more fruitful. It's not a new relationship; it's a renewed relationship, because we have a relationship for more than 45 years, but it has not produced as much as it perhaps could, and the world has changed. So we need to sort of respond to those changes, and I think we have all the tools in our hands to do this.
Okay, thank you.
I think the discussion was extremely useful, I must say. I learned a lot, and basically I can agree with many things that have been said.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much, Charles. Your concluding remarks? Or you want to respond to?
Yes, they are. First, briefly, is there something new? Yes, there is a lot of new things, but there is a lot of old stuff. And I think one of the issues of contention, in fact, the other question about the tariffs, dumping, particularly subsidized agricultural products. And that, as Alex says, is as old as this agreement. It's been there so that aspect of it is fairly old. The second thing someone talked about the media, I actually do, appreciate that. I mean, if as a child you grow up and every time your parents are telling you are no good or you are going to fail, you probably are unlikely to succeed. So a good story helps. Finally, is does this matter in a bigger economic and strategic sense? I actually think that very little, because really virtually no continent has developed or no country has developed while not trading with its neighbors. The wealth is in the neighborhood. I mean, some EU countries, they trade with other countries at the level of 80%. Africa's total imports from itself is about 12%. So I think that it's good. Some industries like the flower industry in Kenya and all these others will benefit. But the big bang to make a difference, it has to be from inside Africa. We have to make regional trade and African trade work. We are not going to hack it with however generous the EU agreements are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my panelists. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Ivan, Charles, and Alexander. Thank you to the audience. It has been an awesome, 1 hour and a few minutes. Thank you so much for persevering up to this time to, participate in these conversations. I believe you have learned, you have, understood a few things that, perhaps you didn't know. It has been my honor to moderate this session on behalf of Center for Multilateral Affairs, the organization that I head. I'm very grateful to have moderated this panel, and I thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Uganda and South Sudan, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you so much, and yes, we look forward to future conversations in this regard. Thank you. Thank you.
A round of applause for Mr. Thank you so much for the moderation, Mr. Moses Owinyi.